Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Secrets to AI Success in Your Security Operations Center. We'll be starting here shortly, and joining us today will be a special speaker from Proficio, Zane West. Great, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Secrets to AI Success in Your Security Operations Center. We're going to get started now, and you'll hear me say a few times during the session as we talk through the agenda, is that if you ever have questions, you have your GoToWebinar chat and QA windows to ask questions, and we'll definitely take questions as they come up. If you have any general questions you don't feel comfortable asking here, or we don't get to your questions given the number of folks that are on the call today, please send us an email, marketing@patternx.com, and we'll be happy to route your questions either to PatternX or our guest, Proficio. So with that, let's take a look at the agenda. We'll introduce ourselves, myself and Zane here shortly in our respective companies. We'll go through some of the key topics. Now, one of the things I think you'll be excited about in this webinar is we'll go through a lot of detail. And so you can kind of take away what you will, whether it's on the business side or the technical side, in terms of this whole process of how Proficio developed a AI SOC, went through that whole process, where does PatternX fit and how did it help them? And then finally, what were the final results, right? At the end of the day, we want to see numerical benefits both on business and revenue, but also on the technology and where did that help? So again, as a reminder, we will have a Q&A at the end, and feel free to use the chat or Q&A window to ask questions. So let's, by way of introduction, again, my name is Kapil Raina. I run marketing here at PatternX, and I'll be sort of your MC or host. And we've been working with Proficio for quite some time here, and they have graciously offered to kind of give us their story of how they use PatternX and just sort of the whole thought process and how they built this up. So let me introduce our guest speaker, Zane West.
Hi, everyone, and Kapil, thanks very much for having me over here. It's a great pleasure. So a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Product Management, so I'm responsible for the development of the solutions, anything that we take to market around, whether it be technical architecture or the go-to-market strategy, the service construction, all that sort of thing as well.
And in case you're not familiar with PatternX, the company's been around for quite some a number of years, and it's really built around core AI technology and people. And we really applied this platform to security. And there's a number of different use cases. But, the three main use cases, whether you're a service provider like Proficio or even an enterprise that has their own SOC, but generally we found three areas that resonate quite well. One is looking at behavior and complex attack analytics. That's something that AI does very well. Increasing productivity in terms of the level 3 analysts. So threat hunters can support more clients and deal with more escalations. And then in some sense, you can reduce not necessarily the number of analysts, but reduce sort of the sophistication the analyst needs to provide and handle all the alerts and false positives. In the end, we need as many we can get in the security business. And so really you need fewer analysts that need a huge amount of training, and that's a boon to everyone in the business. So that's really what we do as a company, and we sell across the globe in the US, the Europe, as well as Asia.
So just a little bit about Proficio as a whole. We are a managed security service provider or an MDR provider, which is primarily focused around the managed detection and response. So we operate 24/7. We use a follow the sun type model where we've got SOCs in Barcelona and San Diego and in Singapore. A couple of the things that we're covering, we do manage the different technologies where you'll see quite a bit about what we're doing from a monitoring perspective and how we're leveraging those technologies as well. But really looking at our clients' environments and their security as a whole. So everything from the managing of the technology, the detection, the monitoring sort of aspects, and then assisting them with the response side of it through some automation and orchestration that we have in place, as well as some other professional services and incident response capabilities. So Kapil, maybe you can just kick us off with a little bit of an overview as to why Pattern X developed their technology and a little bit of a background. It was always an interesting story to me.
Yeah, thanks, Zane. So if we really look at security in general, right? You have sort of the common problems not having enough people. The other problem you have is you might think, okay, well, AI, machine learning can help me out. Well, one of the key elements of AI or machine learning is that you need data. The more data you have, the more sophisticated and accurate your algorithms become, and therefore your automation level increases. The challenge in security is you have what's called the thin label problem. It's one thing to say I can look at all sorts of malware on the endpoint, but how do you detect lateral movement? How do you detect data exfiltrations, let's say through Google or Twitter? That's more sophisticated, and that doesn't happen very often, which means your models don't get trained very often, and therefore they may not catch them. And that was kind of the genesis of how we approached it. And so the way to solve it, among other things, is we take input from security analysts, because that is one thing that we do have as a business, right? We have like Proficio, and you have organizations like that, or you have your own SOC analysts, and we take input into the overall algorithms of the system to really train the system. So when you don't have large amounts of data, you can definitely use an expert like a security analyst to really make the algorithms more efficient. And that was really the genesis of what we started doing. And then as we sort of started deploying this out, we found that there was a real productivity improvement, not just for your tier one analysts to reduce false positives and reduce false negatives, but also for your threat hunter. And that turns out to be a huge boon because there's not too many sophisticated level 3 analysts out there. And so you really want them to be efficient and focused. And then finally, the last piece to it is, you need data for security. And there's so many more places now that you need data from than we did even 10 years ago, whether it's devices, the cloud, what have you. And so that becomes a challenge for organizations in general. But that's something that we were able to really build the architecture around to really manage it so that we can benefit folks like yourself at Proficio in your architecture. So that was really kind of the story and the genesis of how we started and started deploying this quite a number of years ago.
Very good, thank you. All right, so just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of what we have over here on the screen. This is our traditional SOC architecture, and some of the challenges that we were trying to address, much to what Kapil was talking about, is that when we're looking at the way we were operating in our traditional use cases, a lot of that was, we had that very nicely mapped out and aligned with the cyber kill chain. It was looking at the traditional sort of log type data. We're looking at creating use cases that were very specific in each one of those. But although we had to often do a lot of additional investigation associated with with those logs and the content that was coming into that we were using, but it didn't necessarily draw those parallels across from between the different events that were happening across different technology stacks. And that was a much harder thing to do without some sort of a machine learning, sort of an AI capability. We also wanted to make a shift towards a more effective use cases where we're looking to align a little bit more with a MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is, instead of looking at the logs and what has happened, it's looking at the methods and the combinations of various events across the board in order to be able to detect more effectively. Okay, so in order to be able to do that, there is a lot of use cases that you can develop on a traditional SIM platform that are effective in that, but there's only certain methods and it doesn't necessarily draw those parallels. There's certain things that you want to loop back into those, to make a decision and loop back into those where it wasn't that effective in being able to do that. So we were trying to address, how do we make our analysts a little bit more effective? How do we make our use cases and content more effective around what we're doing? And then how do we get into those complex, how do we address and deal with those complex scenarios that are taking our analysts a lot of time to investigate and collect the evidence of that particular event that has occurred.
Okay, great, thanks, Zane. So could you maybe, you obviously showed some of the architecture, could you maybe walk through a little bit about the architecture and how it flows all the way from collection all the way to the analysis that you guys see?
Sure, yeah. So traditionally in our client environments, we have all of the data collection sort of methods. So the log sources sitting down at the bottom. So that's what you're seeing at the bottom. So it's the firewalls, the desktops, Windows servers, networking infrastructure, databases, cloud infrastructure as well. We typically drop a virtual appliance that has the ability to be able to collect that. So whatever SIM platform it is, you'll note on the screen over here, we've got some, ArcSight and Splunk and as well as then a fairly complex stack of combinations with Logstash, Kafka, Elastic, as well as then Spark and Hadoop. So what we're trying to do is, correct that. So once the data is, we can use those agents that are running over there on that appliance, or actually agents are running actually on the log source. We feed it, we connect to our client from our client environments to our data center via a VPN. So sometimes it's TLS, sometimes it's SSL, sometimes it's IPsec VPNs. It's just a combination of depending on what the client's preferences are in terms of how they want to connect to us and feed the data through to us. The next thing for us is that to feed it into Logstash. Now, Logstash is serving multiple purposes. It's identifying where the logs are coming from. It's adding some additional enrichment fields to the front end of the log data, as well as then feeding it into Kafka, and that allows us to be able to sort of forming our common event format, a consistent format around how we want all the logs to be received, so that we can pass it on to the respective systems and platforms. Kafka is really good at handling that multiple direction distribution of the data in terms of where we want to send it. So what we have done now is from Kafka and Logstash, we're able to send it off to Hadoop, Elastic, the traditional SIMs, whether it be ArcSight or Splunk, and send it into that stack. And allowing us to be able to do that. Now, what it also gave us is the ability to do was to now pass the necessary data onto Pattern X for what we're trying to achieve through that. And then finally, it then passes it off. We collect sort of telemetry data from each and every single one of those components, and we use that in our case management. So it's the alerts, it's the events that are occurring. And our case management dashboard, which is running on ServiceNow, as well as then we've got ProView Plus, which is our security portal, which does a lot of the kind of the visualization of our data for our clients to be able to access.
Great, thank you, Zane. Now, can you help us understand? I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Sort of data is king, right? In security, we want as much data as possible to look for threats everywhere we can. And for AI and machine learning, the more data we have, as we mentioned earlier, the better sort of training you can get for it. So can you help us understand? I mean, clearly, with all of your different clients and sort of the different models and et cetera that they have in terms of data management, help us understand, how did you approach sort of the data lake architecture, and where does Pattern X fit into it versus what you're trying to do with it? And then later on, maybe perhaps talk about why it's so important to manage this efficiently.
Sure, yeah. So when we're looking at the kind of the architecture around how we're trying to achieve this, we understood that we wanted to be able to, have a multi-tiered storage, but also make it accessible. We were looking for some performance gains. and kind of understanding. So, a good way, a consistent way of being able to collect it, a good way of being able to pass the data out, as we saw on the previous slide, pass the data out to the systems that need to have that data, and then also being able to pass out what data do they need themselves. So in designing this architecture, it was really important for us to make sure that we understood which data needs to go where and when and why. So, if you think about from a Pattern X perspective, and compared to a traditional SIM. So an interesting thing about the traditional SIMs and ArcSight and Splunk is that we look at the data that we were collecting and we were feeding it into there. And generally the use cases that we're sending a lot of data in there, but generally the use cases that we're building actually only leverage, no matter how many you build, only leveraging a very small percentage. I mean, I think somewhere between 20 and 30% of the total data that we're sending to that, and you think that then drives up cost associated with those. So we're wanting to make sure that we understand that the data is going to the right place for the right reasons. The way Pattern X works a little bit more is because it's building these, these linkages between, based on what it's learning about the environment, it's looking at a lot more of the data. So if we look at, we're passing a higher percentage of the data to Pattern X, but we're looking at a really sort of key focused area based on the models that we're applying to Pattern X, as opposed to what we would want to send on to the SIM. When we look at then Hadoop as the main data store for the long-term storage of our data, we still wanted to be able to easily access that. So we then, that's where we got the combination of passing all data to Hadoop. We pass all data to Elastic as well, but we store it only in Elastic for 90 days because that's traditional search pattern that we're looking for. But we wanted to be able to access the data from Hadoop as well, and being able to ingest it and do some searches against that from Elastic too. So that was hence we introduced the Spark component as well. So what that does is allows us to be able to create a Spark job, go out and query the Hadoop environments, instead of what we would traditionally have to have done with our SIM platforms. We would have to ingest everything of that from a particular archive over X number of days, whatever else it is, ingest everything over there, re-index it, and then be able to run our searches. Whereas it's a bit more of a structured search that we're able to do now, where we can query specific data, only ingest that and index that in there, and for us to be able to provide that data back to our clients. And for the large part, most of this can just be automated. So our entire architecture can be simplified. And the amount of time people are taking to be able to actually go and fetch their data, bring it in, have the right data over there, and if we need more, we can bring back in and go and do an additional query against it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's great. And so then when we think about it, right, so while we want as much data as we possibly get, if you look at, so you mentioned the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, and that's effectively how Pattern X develops its threat models as well, is certain data from certain sources will give you, ability to detect certain kind of threats. So for example, Active Directory data is important if you want to look at insider threats or lateral movement of credential access threats, etc. And so help us understand, based on your understanding of data efficiency, data lake management, but also from the threat perspective you see every day, how do you approach it? How do you prioritize the kind of data you think you or your customers need?
Sure. So when we look at the data and how we're trying to get it into the various platforms, and the type of use cases and the events that we're building around it, what we found with that, where we're really only using 20 to 30% of all of the data that is coming over there, we're trying to say, okay, so which is the most high value? So if we look at a Ceph format, and we've got all of the different log fields that we have in there, we're really trying to be able to populate that as comprehensively as possible. So as you can imagine, certain log sources that are coming in there are providing us with more data. So that's really the driver around the prioritization of what log sources are most important for us. So if you think about from a web filtering provides us a huge amount of value in it's data that it provides within the log. So we're seeing source and destination, and we're seeing the URLs, we're seeing who's authenticated against that, and especially depending on how well the technology is configured. But if you now then combine that with with the next generation firewall, where it's now got it's fully authenticated. It's got the app control sort of type stuff. If you think about a Palo Alto or a Fortinet, where they've now got the application level controls in there, and all of that data is now coming through as a single log line. So now we're getting much more contextual information. If you then start to take that and then combine it with the authentication information you're seeing from the Active Directory and from within the environment, now we're getting additional enrichment. So a lot of these log sources serve us well for both the content that we're trying to write, where it can actually make certain assumptions and around the data quite specifically, but it also provides us with additional contextual information and enrichment that we can use for that. So for example, Active Directory is going to tell me which users are logging on from which machines. From that perspective, if I'm seeing the same users coming on from multiple accounts from a web filtering perspective for location, there's something wrong. There's something I should be looking at. It's not natural. So we want to look at that anomalous type activity. Additionally, if we're looking at DNS type data, DNS logs are important for us as an enrichment from a contextual perspective, from a web filtering perspective, and where we're seeing something happening, or we've got an endpoint security where it's feeding it. It's providing not only in isolation can it help us to detect certain things, but also in context of what else is going on in the environment. It provides us with an enrichment. But not only just the DNS logs are important to us, but also the DNS itself, being able to go back and query against the DNS to be able to resolve certain host names and names and understand the environment and the function of those particular hosts gives us a lot more information. Endpoint security is another interesting one, is that as is often said, I don't really care about the stuff that endpoint security is actually detecting. I care about the stuff that it's not detecting. But it also provides you a lot of asset information. So if you look, that was quite specific to the traditional antivirus type environments, but it's also providing us with a lot of asset information. So a host, what an operating system, potentially applications and stuff that we're installing over there. It's looking at what activity is going on around files, what is normal and what is not normal. So if you're looking at file integrity monitoring, so it's once again, it's in support of, if I see something happening on an endpoint and I see certain malicious traffic happening from that same one and neighboring ones from the web filtering logs, all of those things combining together gives us a lot of high value content and context around what's going on in the environment. Whereas as we start moving down into some of more of the traditional sort of Windows logs and application logs and that sort of stuff, it all becomes very customized and very specific. So from our perspective, it is not that high value for us, although it might have value to a client in a very specific context. It's a lot of custom work. It's not stuff that we can reuse in many cases. And more like cloud platforms and things like this are getting more and more, providing more and more information through the APIs. So it provides us a bit more over there. But so the intent and the whole reason for us being able to prioritize our log data and the log sources is so that in our clients where there's budget constraints around the security and that sort of thing, they're wanting to be able to identify what data is going to provide the most value. So don't give me everything, just give me the stuff that's going to give me high value, and then we'll filter it down to a even more valuable sort of stuff so that we can give them the most value out of a smaller set of data, as opposed to just taking in everything, which just drives up costs and variably and not necessarily serving a much of a purpose.
Very good point, Zane. In fact, from a Pattern X perspective, right, we can support 50 plus data sources in pretty much all of the categories that cover the entire MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So, different providers and different end customers may have different ways to establish this. And the other thing I wanted to support you or point out is that a lot of enterprises or providers may over focus or overemphasize endpoint security, But as you mentioned, there's a lot that's going on in what you don't see, and that's what all the other log sources are for. So while endpoints, sort of visible and it's sort of in your face because it touches every user in your environment, it generally tends to be only one part of the puzzle, and generally there's many ways malware and your adversaries can get around that as well. So excellent points. So up to now we've kind of understood your kind of thought process about what were the whole reasons to go into this architecture, understanding the architecture, some best practices and key points. Zane, can you just step back a little bit and maybe help us understand how you actually evaluated, for example, Pattern X? We are an AI solution, and most end customers don't have a lot of data science experience or people. And so help maybe frame for the audience how you went through the evaluation program and tested something like Pattern X.
Very good, yeah. So this was kind of an interesting journey for us in that it was largely market driven, as in our clients and analysts were saying to us that we should have a machine learning and AI platform, and that's all very well, but it's we can just bolt something on, but we wanted to really understand what the purpose was and go through a systematic process of being able to kind of properly evaluate and figure out what it is that we're doing. So we had our internal, gather internal requirements type thing, and we all had our ideas as to how we could best leverage AI and machine learning and which aspects of it would make the most sense. We also went through this exercise of trying to determine whether or not do we buy or build. And I think that we constantly do that in evaluating our technology. There's a lot of stuff that we've been developing over the years, but now those technologies have evolved significantly, and now it potentially makes more sense to buy. So this was kind of the process that we were looking for. So we had a good idea of what we thought we were going to be able to get out of machine learning and AI and how it was going to tie into our environment. But we went through a round of a series of reviews with respective vendors, Pattern X being one of them, and kind of just really understanding what is their approach, the security value. Is it just a machine learning platform that we would have to build now all that logic around, specifically teach it how to do security specific things, or is there AI platforms that we're going to do? So we looked at quite a lot of those and kind of understood then from our perspective, okay, this is where we see it fitting in our space. It's really what we're going to go after initially, and what's going to provide us with the most value. We then went into, before we actually went into any POCs or even defining what the POC was going to look like, we needed to understand the commercials around it. These are not cheap platforms, and it's a difficult thing for us to be able to pass on to our clients in as part of the solution set and the cost. So we wanted to make sure that the commercial construct around how we would engage with our partner, and we were looking for a partnership. We weren't looking to buy a product off the shelf and buy support. We were looking to make sure that we were achieving that. And because if the commercials just didn't make sense, it's a non-starter. It's literally wasn't going to go anywhere from there. And I think that needed to make sense for both ourselves as well as in the provider that we selected in Pattern X in the end. We all want to grow our business. Then the next one was kind of defining what the POC is. So it's all very well that we're saying, okay, fine, it's got all these features and it's got these bells and whistles and dials and knobs, and we want to be able to see how we can use those. But we need to have clearly defined what is going to be our base level solution set that we're going to go, and how do we now define what criteria is, the evaluation criteria, how are we going to look at that, as well as then how we're going to determine whether or not that was successful or a failure, and that sort of aspect of it. And then another key component was the architecture integration. So there are a lot of components. If you look at, we have a pretty complex architecture, and it's both at the back end where it needs to be able to accept the data, but then also at the front end we need to be able to leverage APIs. We need to be able to look at the results, the alerts, that sort of thing, the visualizations that is providing it, and then provide that onto our clients through our portal and dashboard, and have it fully integrated into our operational processes. So we had to clearly define what that meant to us. During the POC, we kind of needed to run through some very specific things. So the data collection and transfer, so the whole component from when we take it from all the way from the client, how does it hit our environment through the Logstash feed through Kafka? How do we pass it over the top is the set format that we're going to do providing to them? Does it map nicely against their data mappings as well? And then looking at, well, once we're getting the data in now it's about how effective are those standard models. And so it was really around selection of very specific, data types and log types. And this is where we kind of ran into a little bit of a problem where we were looking at our own data, which is an extremely locked down environment. So from our SOC and what we were monitoring typically. And so we weren't seeing a lot of information and not a lot of alerts that were coming out of there. But that being said, we weren't seeing a lot of alerts coming out of there from our standard use cases. So it wasn't really a good comparison. So we did have to introduce a client with some client environments into that assessment and that evaluation process. But now this also then tested that whole data collection process. How seamless would it be, and would it help us through our migration as we moved into putting this into full production? Was we needed to make sure that we understood and evaluated. So it's the connectivity from our client. How do we impact them as little as possible? Pass the data through. It was through our Kafka bus, and then feeding it into Elastic, and it turned out to be fairly feeding it into PatternX. And it turned out to be a fairly simple process in the end for us to just turn it on and over to a matter of a couple of hours, being able to pass certain data through from a client environment. And then we once again just focused on very specific log sources. We turned on very specific models, and then looked at the automated correlation sort of aspects of it. Performance testing was actually relatively easy for us, because we had gone through, PatternX uses a lot of the same sort of building blocks and sort of the same components as what we're doing in our architecture, whereas there's the like Logstash and Elastic sort of components and that sort of thing. So we understood how that scaled horizontally and vertically, what we needed to deploy in each one of those regions. So it was just making sure and validating that it was using, those components, understood how it was, and seeing how it performed against based on the specs that we did put in from in a POC perspective, and making sure that it was working correctly. We did then touch on, through the POC, we only did certain elements of the architecture integration, so because a lot of them require a lot more work, but it was really around making sure that we could leverage the APIs and the technologies and that sort of thing, and just get a full assessment of that sort of component to it. And then finally going into the full POC evaluation, it was now less determined whether or not we were successful in these criteria based on the success criteria we set up at the front. And it was just really just working through the motions of the administrative side of it, making sure that we were happy with the POC, the outcomes that we got, where there were shortcomings, where were those shortcomings we could live with or we could resolve at a later stage. And then selected the vendor, and then went into the contract phase and finalized. And that's where we are now. So going through the deployment phases of the technology.
Excellent, Zane. I think you highlighted a couple of important points here. Again, we've sort of hammered home the thing about data is so important here. The data quality is very important, especially when you evaluate a solution with using AI. And so, as you mentioned, right, when you have a very clean environment, it's just like setting up a burglar alarm in your house, and you spend all this time and money, and you come back a week later and, hey, it hasn't worked. Well, you haven't been, no one's tried to attempt to enter the property in the last week, so it's, you don't know. And so that usually happens when you try to say, okay, I'm just going to focus on sort of the safe area or just my environment. Chances are your environment is probably either clean or just there's not much there. And so, yeah, like you mentioned, you bring real life sort of messy customer data. You can do simulation. A lot of times we'll provide data that we have, customers can get a understanding how the product works, et cetera, for the deployment in the POC process. So super important, and I'm glad to see that you sort of brought that up as well. And by the way, so if you want to read and if you want to read more details about the sort of the technical elements there, we have a case study that we wrote with Proficio, and some of their technical leaders really sort of put us through the whole testing matrix. And so if you want to understand the kind of models that Proficio used, the kind of processing and sort of analysis, and how they look for multi, and all of that, if you go to our website, patternx.com, there is a case study there regarding Proficio that kind of details all of that in more detail. So thank you, Zane. That was very, very helpful. So Zane, if you don't mind, can you perhaps talk about then finally at the highest level, what were the benefits now you're sort of both realizing now as well as anticipating from this AI-enabled solution?
Yeah, so it definitely, I think that we achieved a lot of our objectives and our goals, and I think some of them were a little bit, we weren't really sure how we were going to get there. What we've been able to achieve through this is an expanded services and capability, and I think there's just a much more overall mature. So I think there's been a lot going on, and redesign of our architecture and our platform, and being able to then move into it. It gave us a much quicker access to being able to have a stable content base, which is a minor attack aligned, and which gives us that ability to really look at those threat type focus and that sort of monitoring. The automated cross correlation was kind of an interesting one. We primarily went in there focused on the defined models, so the batch and real-time type models over there. But the automated correlation actually gave us some interesting perspectives and visualizations around what was happening over time, and drawing those linkages between seemingly innocuous events. So there was a kind of an added bonus in terms of how we were able to where we were able to get. And then the analyst investigation optimization was kind of an important one, and I think that what you're seeing in particular, probably more so from the automated correlation, a typical analyst, when they go through a process of being able to, I saw this event, now I need to go and collect all this enrichment information and look if there's related events somewhere else as part of the threat hunting process. That whole process is and through the stuff that we're detecting in Pattern X is significantly streamlined. So it's not, and I think an important thing to note over here, and we haven't maybe emphasized this enough throughout this process, the intent of this is not to replace, and I've seen this quite a few times in other marketing from other MSPs and other organizations, is the intent is not to replace the analyst. It's not getting away from that. It's about being able to let them focus on the right stuff, get away from the administrative tasks of the day-to-day stuff, get all of the information that they're trying to get together in as part of that investigation, and then provide more meaningful information there. So it's about an analyst augmentation sort of the process, potentially getting rid of some of the noise that they're having to deal with, and really just focusing on a lot more qualified information or events, and with drawing those relationships between the particular ones. And then and I think that with all of that, if you're improving overall your analyst investigation times and what you're looking over there, you're generally just improving the mean time to remediation. So a part of our services where we're doing the we manage, detect, and respond. It's in the response side of it. It's all about get a qualified event, something like that, where there is something that we can do about it. If I'm shortening that time, I'm naturally shortening the amount of time where I can react and respond to it, both from our side as well as when our clients are doing the remediation themselves.
Excellent. And so I think one important point is, as you mentioned here, the cross correlation events. So as you mentioned a little while ago, Zane, I think it was a great point that, when you look at endpoints, there's a lot of things you don't see, right? You're interested in what you don't see. And correlation really helps connect the dots, if you will, between the user, their identity, what happened in the firewall, DNS, what they clicked on, all that. And that correlation is super important. And that really helps you understand the full story. We see that used quite a bit in terms of the Pattern X Virtual Analyst Platform product. And I think that definitely leads into the optimizations for investigation, because now you can sort of connect the dots very, very quickly, as opposed to sort of chasing down your EDR software or chasing down all the alerts in the SIM and not really understanding why you're having them. So it's important. And I think the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, I remember even Gartner now sort of promotes that and tells both vendors and consumers and customers that, hey, that is probably the way to look at and monitor and detect your environment, by looking at sort of that whole from reconnaissance all the way to data exfiltration model. And so that, I think that's very, very important to have built your technology around that, because there's definitely a difference in how you approach it. So thanks, really, really appreciate sort of highlighting those benefits. So Zane, if you could, perhaps we can just do a quick summary here. So kind of walk us through, sort of finally at the end of the day, how you look at all of this.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there was a couple of things. So the primary focus over here was, so how do we, through efficiencies, cut our operating costs, but also then provide higher value services. I think that, just in looking at and the kind of the lessons we've learned over the course of this this exercise, was kind of understand the problem you're trying to solve with AI. Understand where you're trying to go with it. Not all security AI platforms are necessarily a match for all organizations and MSPs. Whether you're an MSP or not, it's about finding how you're trying to address it and what you're trying to do and what you're looking to achieve with that. Commercial models is always a much bigger and more important aspect to a solution set than what is necessarily. It's not just as straightforward as just go out there and buy the solution and the technology. And then understanding your data and how you want to use it. I think that was probably one of the biggest lessons that we've learned over the period is that not all data is equal in all systems. So then the architecture should complement your infrastructure. I think that a couple of times in some of these solution sets that we went through was technologies that we were looking at where it was just too kludgy for us to be able to integrate with them and understand the technology stack. So those just wouldn't work for us. And maybe at a future state, when their technology matures a little bit more, it would have made more sense. But at this point in time, we were already focused on what is going to make the most sense, what's going to have the lowest sort of operational impact to us. And be sure to understand your evaluation criteria. I think that was also interesting in trying to determine what it is that we were trying to do and how we were trying to build it out. And not initially going into it with a full understanding of here's the very clear plan as to what we were looking for. So we didn't try to boil the ocean and develop it too much and take on too much at the time. We were looking for what is the minimum viable solution set for us to take to market. We can always enhance and improve on it going forward with. And there's already a few things that we're looking for that we would want to do. So being able to run some of the models against our elastic stack. Would make sense for us. So kind of looking at historical data, it's different type of models, but it certainly would be one of those things that we'd want to look through. Okay, and then and then finally know how AI is going to tie best into you as an organization and your go-to-market strategy and overall solution set.
Excellent, Zane. I think that's a great overview, and I think this hopefully, for your folks in the audience there, the idea today was really to walk you through not just a high level, but really the whole thought process that Zane and Proficio's the whole team there kind of went through. In Pattern X, we see this a lot with our customers, whether large enterprises or other providers like Proficio, where not only does this help efficiency, but the one thing that we learned over time. So one thing we didn't talk too much about in this webinar, and there's other webinars you can definitely go to in terms of understanding this. But one of the elements that your local provider like Proficio has is knowledge of the customer, their environment, and threats, and that can be codified into the Pattern X platform. And so two installations of the same piece of software look very different, right? That is the benefit of AI and taking input from security analysts. So as Proficio's analysts provide inputs, as Proficio's models get trained on the data, that has a unique value to Proficio and its customers. And so that really creates a differentiation, and that helps each organization, each business sort of define what's important to them. So thanks again. And as a reminder, I've already seen some of these come through, is in your Q&A or chat window. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And in case you do get your question, given the number of folks on here, please do send an email to marketing@patternx.com, and whether it's for me or for Zane, we'd be happy to follow up with you afterwards as well. So with that, Zane, there are a number of questions that came in, and I think perhaps the first one would be directed to you, I believe. The question is basically asking about how do you plan for the growth and scale of this solution as you presented?
Yeah, so there was it was kind of an interesting thing. One of the things that we did was we decided to run on AWS, running on a cloud platform as opposed to on traditional hardware, it allows us that flexibility and scale, being able to ramp up. Now, the design of the architecture and the underlying platform was pretty good in that we could easily just add nodes, worker nodes, things like this, just based on where performance requirements are being hit the most on the technology stack. So we looked at geographic regions, so we're deploying the independent platforms to the 3 different regions that we're operating in, as well as then being able to understand the technology stack. So not only it's a combination of CPU, memory, performance, geographic distribution, performance that you would get based on lags across global networking and that sort of thing. So we looked at kind of optimizing that architecture globally based on how do we keep the platform closest to the data and the data that we're going to be using.
Great, thank you. And I think here's another one that might be suited for you, and this is a great question. So you did mention, reference to SIM and perhaps some of the inefficiencies there, but the question was what drove the decision in terms of not developing your own solution potentially, or even using maybe some of the add-ons on the traditional SIMs?
So, I mean, I think that part of that is just looking at the base models that we're going to be able to get just out of the box in terms of how far it would take us along the road of being able to do, align with the MITRE ATT&CK framework and get more of the threat-focused type models. The machine learning capabilities on a lot of the traditional SIM platforms, and there's some other solutions out there, are good in context, and it's serving very specific purposes, but you still have to build the models, and then you have to now have to train it. And so there's a lot of work that goes into that background process of there, and we just looked at time to market and being able to offer this as a solution and a capability on top of our existing services that we're offering. And also we have this idea of this concept of being able to modularize our service. So we want to be able to bolt on things in addition and remove it. So by being dependent on a particular SIM platform or a particular solution, without being able, it restricts us in terms of our growth and potential. In 5-10 years time, maybe the solution that we're looking for has moved on a little bit and now changed in our business model. We want to be able to adapt our architecture and solution sets accordingly. So being able to have a dedicated solution set with that base set of models that make the most sense for us and aligns best with the way we're wanting to go was ultimately the right solution for us.
Excellent. I think that's a great answer. Thank you. So there's a question regarding Pattern X, and I can obviously address that. With all of the data potentially going through Pattern X, at least in sort of the architecture you showed, and typically, is not going to be costly for me, I guess, he's indicating him as the end customer or my provider. The answer to that is no. So Pattern X, our value proposition is not based on data volume. You can ship as many logs sources as you like, send as much data as you want. In fact, that helps improve the value of the product as well. We don't charge by data volume. We don't charge by the data source type, etc. So again, we want to encourage you to send as much data as possible for your provider directly to the product, because that means there's a higher chance we'll be able to detect these more sophisticated attacks. We charge based on the entity. Typically, that's number of employees or users on the system. It can be other things like IPs, etc. But generally, users is what we focus on, and so that's a very easy way to consume and understand it. And so, send us all your data. The other thing that I want to highlight is that what we see a lot of customers do today is they may have a data source, let's say firewall. So Zane, you mentioned that as sort of an important one, but they may not turn on the sort of a verbose mode of the logging, right? Because again, logging is expensive and it's difficult to manage, search, etc. And so here we can not only encourage you to, for example, give us your firewall logs, but even encourage you to turn on additional data information that we can potentially use. So that's very important. So it's not just about the number of sources or the amount of logs, but it's also that. And in fact, there was a story I can share with you. We have one customer who's a head of security of this large organization, And when he sort of was doing the investigation, they realized that the threat they had actually started almost about 13 months before then. But as it turns out, they were rotating and dropping logs every 12 months. So they could not get to the source and understand how the original attack happened to really kind of defend against it. And so that was an interesting story of, because SIMs are expensive and you have to sort of manage them in terms of the data that you send. That was an interesting story because that is true. I mean, your average detection from time to detection is hundreds of days. And so that's really, really important. So I think that's a great question. Again, as a reminder, in case we don't get to your question, there's quite a number here, a number of folks. Send an email to marketing@patternx.com, whether it's for me or for Zane. We're happy to route that and get back to you there. Okay, another question here. So Zane, definitely looks like one for you. In a service provider, managed service provider, how big is a factor for multi-tenancy in an AI platform?
So I think that is just about everything in an MSP provider is multi-tenancy is a factor. So looking at, and that was probably one of our key criteria, is making sure that the data as ingested is separated out as well. And I think that the importance of that, you don't want any sort of cross-pollination of data and events that are happening across the environment. So it's important to be able to, both from a user access control as well as from a data set control. So we need to look at a client environment in its isolation. If you imagine, if we're kind of mixing up data, there's always this possibility that it's going to get confused as to which client this was for, and then identify certain seemingly events that were not necessarily part of that. I think then also coming into, if you think about data sovereignty and then also things like GDPR and a lot of the compliance environments over there, each and every single one of them have a restriction for the MSPs and service providers to be able to completely isolate the client-specific data in every aspect.
That's a great point, Zane. In fact, what I would add is that within sort of how AI works, and definitely within the way the PatternX virtual analytics platform software works, is that as you train data, the data is proprietary. The data is something you want to protect for privacy and other issues. But the model that you train that data on can be actually used for another customer and then trained again. And so as you sort of see different environments, the model gets more and more sophisticated as you go from customer to customer, yet you don't necessarily have to share the data itself. And so that's the beauty of the approach that at least PatternX has taken, is that you can train models across different kinds of customers and benefit the next customer, and then benefit even more the next customer, and so on and so forth. And so even in a multi-tenant environment, there's many ways that a provider like Proficio using PatternX can definitely deal with the data in a safe manner, but very, very efficient manner.
I think that's an important point there, because it's the model, retraining the model based on a different client environment. If you think about the contextual changes that happen from client to client, there's not a single environment that is the same. So the model is going to respond slightly differently based on what it knows about that particular environment. So which is a huge separation from what you would get out of a traditional use case. The traditional use case would be looking at very specific things. It will always respond in exactly the same way. So another added benefit to the learning model.
That's a good point, Zane. In fact, that kind of leads into the next question here, and I think I can definitely address that. But the question is, I already have rules, like presumably from the SIM, or maybe the provider is doing some kind of analysis manually. So what more? I mean, why can't I just use the rules? The rules, there may be a place for sort of, if you have a deterministic sort of threshold thing you want to do. So for example, you're always going to look at John Doe, who's an admin, and you're always going to say, whenever John Doe logs in incorrectly more than 3 times, send me alert. If your environment is that static and that's really the only thing you're looking for, a rule works really well. Where an AI model or machine learning helps is when you look at not just anomalies. Anomalies are, okay, John is part of the admin group, and admins typically don't, get their login wrong more than once or twice. And if John gets it wrong 3 times, well, that's an alert, right? That is sort of a simple model. But where it gets a little bit more interesting and more useful, because you want to reduce your false positives, right? Both as a provider as an end customer, is if you can sort of say, okay, well, not only do I want to see how John is performing against his peers within this group, right? But I want to look at other factors, like, for example, is John logging in from home? I want to look at other factors, like, was John in a separate incident, maybe a separate endpoint flag or a separate incident where he went to a different website just before he logged in? Was he marked suspicious in that transaction? So perhaps he opened up an email just before he logged in into a server or system, for example, with his admin credentials. And then, what other communications has John had, perhaps potentially even before he logged in or after he logged in? So those kind of scenarios, which are essentially what we talk about, the sort of behavioral analytic model in this case, those are the most interesting things, because that's essentially how in sort of most attacks that succeed, it's going to be sophisticated that way. It's not very straightforward where, they click on a link and boom, data leaves. It's not straightforward. And in fact, most of the time, as we mentioned earlier, these attacks are very spaced out. And part of that is because a adversary is, infecting a million different machines using some kind of malware or a phishing site, and they're going to go back later, verify that that endpoint is still infected, and then go do something about it. So that could be months or potentially a year plus before an infected endpoint is then compromised. So knowing this kind of information through an AI model, which is essentially what led you guys over there at Proficio to really kind of look at a different approach, right? I think when Proficio talks about threat-based detection and sort of an AI approach, that's really what they're getting at. So again, rules have a place where you have very simplistic, very threshold, static environments. But as we've seen, especially for threat detection, when you look at the MITRE ATT&CK the scenario matrix, there's more sophistication and more analytics. And some of our models have, I don't know, well over 30 plus analytics in some cases, and we have over 1,000 plus analytics overall in the product itself. So there's a lot there to work with. I mean, we have over 100 AI models out of the box, but doesn't necessarily mean that all of them are going to apply to you. It just means that that's all there. So again, making it much easier, even if you decide that rules itself may be limiting. So I think with that, there are a bunch of other questions, Zane, but I think what we'll do is we'll give them the time frame. And again, send an email to marketingpatternx.com when you have a question for Zane or myself. If you have colleagues that registered but couldn't attend, no worries. We'll be sending them a link for later on. And we will replay this webinar both on demand and live in the future. So take a look at our website or at Proficio's website for that. And so with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank Zane at Proficio for taking the time to talk about the story and how they went through all of this. And hopefully you found all that very helpful. So thank you all. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.